From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the CIA drone strike that killed al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul, Afghanistan on July 31st. Today's program will be divided up into three segments, each with a different MEI scholar, to provide a variety of perspectives on the Zawahiri strike and its implications. We'll be touching on what it means for U.S. counterterrorism policy, internal Taliban dynamics and relations with the U.S., and al-Qaeda as an organization, both in Afghanistan and globally. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. First up, I'll be speaking with Mick Mulroy. Mick is a non-resident senior fellow at MEI and co-director of the Yemen Steering Initiative, an ABC News national security analyst, and a co-founder of the Lobo Institute. He previously served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, a CIA paramilitary operations officer in the Special Activities Center, and a United States Marine. Mick, welcome back to the program, and thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be with you, Alistair.
Mick, let's dive right in. What do we know at this point about the operation to take out al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri and how it came together?
So most of it's coming actually from the briefings of the White House. And from what they have described, it looks like it was a multi-month-long intelligence collection effort that identified the location of the family of Zawahiri, determined that he was going to link up with them, and then followed them into Afghanistan, into a certain neighborhood in Kabul, which is where most of the leadership of the Taliban live, and then was able to find the location, develop a pattern of life on Zawahiri himself, and then actually do surveys to determine the type of building to ensure it would not collapse from a kinetic strike, and then actually, I think, pulled off an incredible operation, a real masterclass in how to do these type of operations. So that's, to my knowledge, and that comes from open source and actually the White House itself.
What are your key takeaways from the strike?
So I do think it shows we can do over-the-horizon operations. I don't know, even the people like myself who are opposed to the full withdrawal without leaving a residual force would have said that, yes, the United States can do over-the-horizon operations, which is a military term for we're not present on the ground, but we can come from another country and facilitate counterterrorism operations. So, yeah, it shows that we can do that. I always thought we could, but it did create a significant challenge for the intelligence community once we removed, 99% of our intelligence collection capability in country. So it proves it, but it also proves, and I think that the administration and certainly my old colleagues or my former colleagues, I'm not saying they're old, I'm older than them. My former colleagues at the CIA conducted an incredible operation. They deserve a lot of credit. But unfortunately, it does show that terrorists all the way up to and including the leader of al-Qaeda felt like it was safe to be in Afghanistan now. Not just in Afghanistan, but in the capital. And I think that's very troublesome, both from the point of view of Afghanistan becoming a safe haven for terrorist organizations who could plot against the United States and our allies from there. But also it shows that not only is the Taliban not a partner, they're an adversary. In the media, it would appear that the number two, Siraj Haqqani, was likely responsible for keeping Zawahiri, the emir of al-Qaeda, in this house. And that shows that they are actively opposed to the national security interests of the United States. They completely did not uphold their end of the Doha Agreement, and it means we have a serious problem when it comes to Afghanistan and terrorist activity in the future, I think.
Just wanted to follow up on a couple of points that you made there. What's your kind of broader assessment of the CT threat in Afghanistan at this point, based on the fact that the Taliban was willing to give shelter to someone that the U.S. government has been targeting for decades now and has been such a high value and important target for us?
I think it clearly indicates that the Taliban considers al-Qaeda to be a philosophical partner to them. They did before September 11, 2001, hence why we had to go and remove them. I don't think they've changed at all, quite frankly, since that time. I don't think we should trust anything that they have to say. on the matter, and it's likely that the United States is going to have to take further steps to isolate that government, which unfortunately is only going to hurt. It's going to hurt the governing body, but it also will hurt the people of Afghanistan who are going through some really trying times right now. That is not a good thing at all, and it would indicate to me that Al Qaeda believes they still. They would be cautious, I think, and not stand on balconies and present yourself as such a target. But I do think that, especially outside of Kabul, they may feel that they need to come back there. And there's some indications in the press that Saif al-Adil, who is the next most senior Al Qaeda leader, don't know if he'll take the mantle, but he certainly was considered the deputy. He may be coming from Iran and going to Afghanistan. So that indicates that Al Qaeda thinks that Afghanistan is a place they can be. There's also a significant problem with ISIS Khorasan, or ISIS-K as we call them. They are an offshoot, but they are vehemently opposed to the Taliban and have been launching a civil war. But they could gain further territory, and they, of course, as well, could pose a threat to Western interests with plotting external attacks. So I don't mean to be a doomsdayer right on the eve of a very successful mission. I think that should be recognized, but it also shouldn't be overstated that this is going to be the end of terrorist activities and therefore counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan. I think this is only the beginning.
You touched on the issue of the over-the-horizon capability earlier, but I want to drill down on that in a little bit more detail. I think there's a difference between can do something and can do something sustainably on an open-ended basis going forward. So I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on that aspect of it. How sustainable do you think that approach is for dealing with Afghanistan and the CT challenge there in the longer term?
It is very challenging, and that's why I meant by just the beginning. It's obviously we've been having terrorism operations for 20 years in Afghanistan. I would say this is the beginning of a new phase of those operations. Because of the remoteness, because of the over-the-horizon part of our CT operations, we don't have the boots on the ground that you hear so much in the media. I don't know if that includes my former colleagues. I'm not going to speculate on that. But having real capable assets is going to be incredibly important, not just in their willingness to take significant risk, but also their ability to do so and, quite frankly, get us the information we need to facilitate these types of operations, because that is incredibly difficult. And just to give you an example, if Zawahiri wouldn't have been a person who had a strong pattern of life in which they went and presented himself on a balcony, how else would we have done this? Would we have tried to level a building inside a urban area without being able to identify him? I don't think so. So that would indicate to me, in my past experience, that we'd be looking for some kind of direct action force to go and get him. Well, that's very unlikely to happen right now in Afghanistan. So our capabilities are limited. We don't have, JSOCs stationed and ready to go at Bagram Airfield like we did or would have had if we would have kept a residual force. We simply have to rely on these means. Great operations and proved that we could do it. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't obstacles that they had to jump through to be able to do that from the withdrawal. That is, in many ways, water under the bridge. It's not going to be relitigated and we're going to change our course. But it's important to note that we shouldn't expect these operations to happen on a regular basis. These are very difficult and take a long time to prepare and execute.
There's been a lot of focus in the media reporting about the R9X Hellfire missile that was used in the strike itself. And I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on how technological developments in recent years have affected CT efforts and made it easier to carry out these sort of operations.
Yeah, good question, Alistair. So without getting into too many specifics, I've seen the evolution of, in my career there, our whole drone operation. And at first, we had the ability to use what I would say is conventional munitions to strike targets, and they were largely done in remote areas because of the collateral they inflicted. That didn't take long for the people that we were targeting, al-Qaeda senior leaders, to figure out if they stayed in urban areas, especially around targets that we would not be comfortable shooting around, children, for example, that they would be in some ways protected. So in my experience in the past, I saw it to a level where targets we were looking at would actually place children in the cargo racks on the top of their vehicles so that the U.S. could clearly see them, and obviously we wouldn't take a strike. So it has been an effort technologically to keep up with the tactics that they use. And I don't want to get into specifics, although it is in the press, but the U.S. intelligence community and then eventually the special operations community developed an ability to strike a target with very low collateral. This is largely because we were uncomfortable, very uncomfortable with collateral damage where civilians that were in the vicinity were killed or injured. And this type of ammunition allows us to do that. So the individual targeted, we should never take any kind of glee in any death, but that individual is essentially vaporized by blades that spin over 1,000 miles an hour, very concentrated, impacting with very close precision. But people standing as close as you would be talking to the person on the street would not be injured. That really changed the game, I think, as far as where we could target people. It terrorized the terrorists, which is, of course, a good thing. But it also significantly reduces, or in some cases eliminates, civilians or non-combatants in the area being injured at all. And that's what it looks like was the case here, where his family was left unharmed, and he obviously was killed.
Great insights, Mick. Taking a step back, what do you see as the kind of broader implications for USCT policy moving forward, especially in regard to Afghanistan?
Well, at CT, it spikes in interest when we see large-scale terrorist attacks. I think the United States needs to move away from this idea that the fight in this regard is ever going to be over. I equate it to, you don't see police officers talking about the end of the war on crime. It's not going to end, unfortunately. I mean, certainly we can do things to reduce crime, and certainly we can do things to reduce terrorist activities. But I think we need to accept the fact that we need to have very competent professionals persistently on the counterterrorism mission in perpetuity. That is the only way. That's what they do. They have completely devoted terrorists that are going to give their life if necessary to carry out the means of their organizations, which in many cases means to attack and kill Americans. We need to have Americans that are just accept the fact that's what they're going to do for their career, and then the next generation, the next generation. If it goes away, that will largely be an economic advancement that's beyond the control of the intelligence and special operations community. I'd like to see that, of course, but we have to accept that the counterterrorism operations are here to stay. They're going to take many shapes and forms, and they're going to spread all over the world. It won't just be in the Middle East. It isn't now, but we need to be able to adapt to it and always be better at defending ourselves than they are at attacking us.
That's all we have time for today, but thank you very much for joining the program, Mick.
Great to be here.
Next on the program, I'll be speaking to Javid Ahmad. Javid is a non-resident scholar with the Afghanistan and Pakistan and Countering Terrorism and Extremism programs at the Middle East Institute. He's also a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center, and he previously served as Afghanistan's ambassador to the UAE. Javid, welcome back to the program, and thank you very much for joining us today.
For having me, Alistair.
There's been a lot of media coverage and analysis of the strike on al-Zawahiri, but I want to get your key takeaways. What stood out to you?
Well, there are several immediate takeaways, even though it's still somewhat early after the operation. So we'll have to wait how both al-Qaeda and their various Taliban partners in Afghanistan and beyond articulate their own joint or individual respective responses. But I think for now, how I see it is that al-Zawahiri strike, or this house call on a safe house in central Kabul, just minutes away from the Taliban's Central Intelligence boss of the presidential palace, painted a very disturbing picture of this very deep faith that various jihadist groups, including al-Qaeda, still places in their Taliban partners. And as I said, these are not just one Taliban partner, it's various Taliban partners. And I think these partnerships are quite multi-layered. So breaking that up is not an easy task. And I would assume that it's perhaps not even a cakewalk for the most saner of the factions within the Taliban. So far, no pressure, military or otherwise, have changed that. But what the strike does tell is that Afghanistan has long been regarded as too dangerous to fail. It's been a wilderness in this very changing region that's replete with numerous variants of jihadist groups, and there's a growing appeal now of violent Islamic nationalism. But as we're also now seeing this increasing weaponization of anti-Americanism, including in places like Pakistan in recent days. And I think in all of this, and despite the proliferation of these groups and despite many counterterrorism campaigns that's been undertaken with mixed results so far against a variety of these groups, and others are still emerging, I think the grim outlook in Afghanistan today, 1 year after America's withdrawal and 1 year after the Taliban have reclaimed Afghanistan, it represents this physical reminder of our collective failure of imagination. So how I see it is, because there's so much we can learn from it, but if there's one thing we can learn from this episode is that at the heart of America's past engagement and then subsequent disengagement for Afghanistan are two important paradoxes that requires immediate recognition. In the past, when the U.S. was engaged in Afghanistan, I think the more this paradox was that the more the United States pushed to leave Afghanistan, the more it adversely created a condition for it to stay in the country. Now that the United States has withdrawn and the Taliban are back in charge now, the paradox presently is that, and this is something that needs to be reckoned with, is that Afghanistan may never have been this safe, but it has never also been this dangerous. And I say this mainly because the Taliban's takeover have effectively broadened the wider terrorism landscape in Afghanistan. That landscape have effectively morphed. There's commercial jihadism that has really increased. There's scores and scores of independent jihadists and unaffiliated fighters that are freely roaming across the country. There are various competing jihadist groups that have now engaged with one another to, reach some kind of a reconciliation among themselves. Some are negotiating separate pieces among themselves. Others are reorganizing to establish tactical partnerships. So in all of this, the Taliban have also steadily engaged for their own part in cementing, but also at times renegotiating their own arrangement with various groups, including al-Qaeda, the Pakistani groups, the Uzbek, the Tajik, the Uyghur, the Baloch. And it's blossoming.
Javid, what impact do you think this strike will have on the internal Taliban dynamics? Is it likely to strengthen kind of group cohesion and resolve, or perhaps exacerbate some of the existing tensions and fissures?
That's a very important issue to watch in the weeks ahead, but we'll have to wait until the dust settles, and we'll see once the Taliban senior ranks do their own hot wash as to what happened in what their after action report says, if and should they make it public. But for now, though, inside Afghanistan, it is the Haqqani family who have effectively taken the lead in directing and steering the Taliban's overall response to al-Zawahiri's death, including, staging anti-American street protests. They've pushed the media campaign on Twitter and elsewhere to condemn the U.S. strike. And I think in many ways they're faced with this risk of possible defections within the Taliban ranks, broader Taliban ranks. So the Haqqanis appears to be, their overall objective appears to be to make an attempt at appealing to not only its own ranks and followers, but also others among the broader Afghan society by fueling anti-American sentiments, weaponizing those sentiments which effectively serve for their part as force multipliers. So for now, I think there are two or maybe three possible developments to monitor with respect to the impact. One is that given that senior Taliban Haqqani members knew about al-Zawahiri, as indicated by U.S. officials in their statements, I think this blindsiding of the Haqqanis of some Taliban leaders, like within their senior ranks, could potentially result in some kind of a leadership rearrangement among the Taliban governing partners, particularly between the Haqqanis and the Kandahari camps. The second is that given Pakistan's extensive ties with the Haqqani family, it is within reason to conclude that there may have been some kind of Pakistan's complicity or awareness in al-Zawahiri's affair, despite Pakistani claims of maximal deniability. So what to watch here is how this may strengthen Pakistan's hand in any possible reshuffling in the Taliban senior ranks, and how that may affect Pakistan's own relationship with the Taliban governing partners. And I think third is that it's very important is that is something to watch is what impact the Zawahiri strike may have on al-Qaeda's own relationship with its various Taliban partners, or what al-Qaeda's response may be. So how I see is that whatever the impact of Zawahiri's killing on al-Qaeda's Taliban ties, which again is pretty historic, multi-layered, the Taliban would likely reach an accommodation with al-Qaeda to contain any potential a key reprisal or overreaction that's directed at the Taliban or elements within the Taliban. And I think this could potentially involve, more intelligence sharing with that group. There could be possible repositioning of al-Qaeda sites. We may also see some possible assassinations inside the Taliban ranks. There could be tightening of key personnel for operational security. But for now, we may see some weakening at the leadership core level, which is pretty expected, but I don't think al-Qaeda's longer-term tactical staying power in Afghanistan will diminish.
Javid, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that, quote, by hosting and sheltering the leader of al-Qaeda in Kabul, the Taliban grossly violated the Doha Agreement. Well, the Taliban have also chastised the U.S. for violating the deal. What do you think this means for the future of the Doha Agreement?
I'm not even sure if the Doha Agreement still stands in letter and spirit. Look, I mean, after each Western or American action, the frequent Taliban response has been to accuse the United States of violating the Doha Agreement. And for its part, the United States has been doing the same thing, and for very good and obvious reasons, as was observed in al-Zawahiri's killing recently. But elements of the Doha Agreement that still, in my mind, stands is one of those, or basically like one of the two classified annexes that were signed as part of the deal. And perhaps those are the only two things or one thing that still stands as part of the Doha Agreement. So the second classified annex was an operational plan that involved a step-by-step detail of U.S. withdrawal plans from Afghanistan. Now, that part is done, but the second part that concerned purely counterterrorism promises involving very specific promises from the Taliban side still stands. So, and this includes, for example, to not allow al-Qaeda or other Salafist jihadist groups to plan and plot against the United States from Afghan soil, or the Taliban issuing them travel documents. So for now, we have no visibility into the inner workings of the Taliban regime and whether or not they have issued, for example, travel documents to jihadist elements, which would be in violation of one of those annexes. It's also very much possible, given that the Ministry of Interior is led by Siraj Haqqani, and that's basically the ministry that have long been responsible for issuing police clearances, also travel documents, including passports, that they may have issued these kind of documents in violation of the Doha Agreement, because the central passport agency in Kabul is led by a senior Haqqani member. And I could tell you that at the time of Afghanistan collapse last year, at this time, there were about 1.5 million blank passports, blank Afghan passport that were still left in the Interior Ministry and the Central Passport Agency. So it's really hard to tell how many of those passports went to the Haqqani jihadist partners, which obviously would be a serious threat in violation of the Doha Agreement. Now, what the United States could do in its part is to perhaps consider declassifying one of those two classified annexes of the agreement to see if we could publicly scrutinize whether the Taliban are in fact living up to its counterterrorism promises. From Zawahiri strike, we don't see that's happening.
Javid, knowing what we know now, how would you like to see U.S. policy change moving forward? How do you think Washington should respond and deal with the Taliban?
It's a tough question. I think going forward, a few things. One is that the United States need to reevaluate its Taliban policy, perhaps by considering a few things. First is that we need to determine if are we looking to find in support a counterweight to the Taliban? And if so, is there a viable competitor among the non-Taliban forces that's broadly acceptable to most Afghans? I can tell you this, that for now, no viable or organized anti-Taliban competitor, political or military, has emerged among the non-Taliban forces so far. And these forces are also vastly divided, unfortunately. So if that option isn't practical for now for the United States, or if there's no appetite for such an engagement, then are we looking to find an institutional counterweight within the Taliban ranks to perhaps inform and shape Taliban choices and action, which we have very little leverage over? And if so, in that case, the most particular group that would need to be targeted for that kind of engagement to effectively cultivate that kind of institutional counterweight or institutional arrangement to senior Taliban ranks would be the powerful clerics in Kandahar who are effectively pulling the strings. The second thing is that with the United States now gone from Afghanistan, the Afghan problem has been largely regionalized because it is a regional problem. So solutions should also be now regionalized. But in doing so, I think it's very important not to pick one country in that region, chaotic as it may be, and then kind of treat that one country as a solution to Afghanistan. I think that would, repeat the past, this vicious, toxic pattern or cycle in U.S.'s engagement, which will, I think, involve at times caving in to those countries by giving away effectively the farm in return for a sheep. And I don't see that as a wise play on the U.S. part, should that happen. Now, one fundamental thing the U.S. should avoid is not front-loading concessions. It should not front-load concession, whether those concessions are to the Taliban in return for whatever, or whether those concessions are to regional forces that control or shape these Taliban choices. Instead, and because I mentioned the clerics, the powerful Taliban clerics, instead, the important thing to consider here is that because ideology is so deeply entrenched in every Taliban action and every Taliban choice, the United States need to kind of creatively engage directly in some kind of a religious diplomacy. And I'm not saying that the U.S. diplomats in embassies or annexes need to start acting like religious diplomats. But one thing we need to recognize is that we need to kind of build that common language with these clerics who are effectively the ones who are pulling the strings and who command greater legitimacy and greater control among the Taliban senior ranks. So and why I'm underscoring is that however the United States ends up engaging with the Taliban, it will effectively, going forward, set the rules and standards for America's future engagement with similar groups and similar kind of militant emirates in other parts of the world.
Before we wrap up, Javid, any final thoughts?
It's been great. We'll look forward to watching, how developments unfold in the days ahead, what Taliban responses may be, or whether or not there is some kind of an al-Qaeda reaction or overreaction to al-Zawahiri's killing, including one that's directed at the Taliban, and how that relationship will evolve.
That's all we have time for today, but thank you very much for joining the program, Javid. And finally on today's program, I'll be talking to Douglas London. Douglas served in the CIA's clandestine service for over 34 years, mostly in the Middle East, South and Central Asia, and Africa, including 3 assignments as chief of station. He teaches intelligence studies at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. He's also the author of the book, The Recruiter, Spying and the Lost Art of American Intelligence. Doug, welcome back to the program, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks. Always appreciate being included.
Let's dive right in. There's been a lot of discussion about the strike on al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri and its implications, but what are your key takeaways?
Removing Zawahiri from the battlefield was important from a number of perspectives. Perhaps most importantly, the sense of justice for the struggle and the victims of 9/11. But that's not to take away from his important role for al-Qaeda. He's not necessarily a planner of operations, but he does set forth the vision. And he's been important to the organization and seeing them through some hard times and keeping the affiliates, such as those in Yemen and North Africa and Syria, in the al-Qaeda orbit. So there'll be a short-term disruption in terms of leadership and perhaps communications, some logistical matters such as recruitment and finance. But long-term, al-Qaeda is still going to be a threat, and we'll talk about that certainly later. We also, I think, see a bit more about the Taliban here from the strike, the fact he was in Kabul, and certainly we could touch on that a little bit more. But while no surprise, it suggests to me that not only the relations between the Taliban and al-Qaeda are very strong, but I think the Taliban in general is not going to abandon its partners among the extremist groups, be they some of the Kashmiri independent groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba or Tehrik-Taliban Pakistan, which threatens Pakistan. So I think that certainly has to be a consideration for the United States and also Afghanistan's neighbors in the region.
Doug, you touched on it briefly, but I want to kind of drill down on this in a little bit more detail. Why do you think Zawahiri was in central Kabul? Was it a sign of how comfortable he was under the Taliban rule, or was it perhaps something else that accounted for that?
Well, I believe Zawahiri being on a balcony during daylight hours is a reflection of his comfort, but I don't necessarily think it was his choice to come to Kabul. My suspicion is that that was from Taliban pressure as a means for them to maintain some leverage over him and the organization. Taliban's happy to have the al-Qaeda operatives and fighters there in Afghanistan. They'll enable them to a great degree, but they at least want to have the appearance that they're not facilitating external attacks from Afghan soil. So I think it was their pressure to have them there. It was a decision known to the Taliban leadership, and certainly under the auspices of the Haqqani network, which runs Kabul and most of the east. After all, Khalil Haqqani runs the city's security, and he's the uncle to Siraj Haqqani, who's the acting interior minister and still has a $10 million bounty on his head. So not shocked, but I don't think it was necessarily Zawahiri's first choice.
How do you assess the threat from al-Qaeda at present, and how do you think this might impact the group and its affiliates more broadly?
The United Nations put out reports in May and June of this year, which is really drawn from intelligence provided by member states, including the United States and its Western allies and other countries throughout the membership. The suggestion that al-Qaeda is a bigger long-term threat than ISIS is one that I agree with, because al-Qaeda's main core component is striking the West. They've often spoken about, taking the head off the snake, and that's the United States. So they have the long-term intent to strike the United States, ideally in the homeland for them, or certainly externally. ISIS certainly wants to do that as well, but is pretty much preoccupied among its local affiliates with local issues. And you can certainly say the same for al-Qaeda, that its external groups, such as those in Yemen and North Africa and Syria and East Africa, are focused on local issues, but they also carry that ongoing intent and effort to strike the West externally, strike the United States specifically. So the loss of Zawahiri is important. It shouldn't be underestimated. He's not a planner. One of the things he did was really to enable the affiliates, to give them autonomy over their tactics and planning as long as they adhere to the vision, that vision being to strike the West. So I still see a long-term threat from al-Qaeda, a complicated one to penetrate given its decentralization, and one we shouldn't underestimate.
Just following up on that, what do you see as the most worrisome affiliates within the al-Qaeda network at this point?
The al-Qaeda members who were dispatched to Syria originally as part of the Khorasan group were really carrying the mission to strike the West and to develop external operations. To my understanding, that's been handed over to Kharas al-Din, which succeeded that group in Syria. So I see them as still maintaining that mission. At least a part of that group is focused on external ops. I still see other elements of the organization, such as the affiliates in the Sinai, as having looked towards external operations, in their case, more focused on Israel, but the West in general. And the group in Yemen, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, has always long sought to strike the West. Ibrahim Hassiri, the bomb maker who's now dead, and Anwar al-Awlaki, obviously, we recall, who's also been removed, were very much focused on striking the West. And I don't think those groups have abandoned that. I think the affiliate in South Asia is also one to watch for, at least certainly in the region, and that mission hasn't ever flailed, and they'll continue pursuing it to the degree they can.
Doug, there's been a fair bit of speculation about who might take over leadership of al-Qaeda moving forward. What's your view on how that process could play out, and what do you see as the key challenges facing al-Qaeda as it changes leadership for the first time in more than a decade?
It'll be fascinating to watch. Saifa Adel, who's an Egyptian, a former military officer who really came with Zawahiri from the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, is considered to be the most likely successor. He was essentially number 3 in the group behind Abu Muhammad al-Masri, who was killed in an assassination in Tehran in August of 2020, one that's ascribed, at least in the media, to the United States and or Israel. And Saif has a lot of experience. He was very much involved in the 1998 bombings, for which he's indicted, as was Abu Muhammad, less involved in the 9/11 bombing, but he certainly has the intent to carry the mission to the West. The challenge is there. One is that Saif Adel doesn't have a reputation for working and playing well with others. He has sharp elbows. He's volatile. He's not necessarily well-liked by other groups, but he's maintained much of the communications and certainly inherited that when Abu Muhammad was removed in 2020. So he makes the most sense, but if he's still in Iran, that would be a difficult pill to swallow for the Iranians. The Iranians, in my opinion, are happy to enable al-Qaeda's presence in Iran to maintain communications and continue plotting and doing its business. But I don't think they want to have the emir of al-Qaeda sitting in their backyard. So if he's still there, they might be interested in having him move. Now, after all this is said and done, it's all the Shura members, the management council, which really includes the emirs of the various affiliates, who have to endorse whoever succeeds Zawahiri and swear bayat loyalty to him. So they could, be a wild card. I don't think they will, because there is a second generation of younger al-Qaeda members, a number of Arab al-Qaeda members who fled Afghanistan to Iran, who might be there, might have returned, and obviously those among the other affiliates who might have actually a more progressive vision for the group, which still seems to be stuck, at least under Zawahiri's leadership, in old school thinking and old school propaganda. And I don't know that the old guard is ready to hand over the reins just yet.
Doug, how do you think the strike might affect the Taliban-al-Qaeda relationship going forward?
I don't think it's going to really undermine it much. That relationship is strong and it's going to endure problems. I believe the Taliban is a little bit concerned about narrative and how it's seen in the West. But, at the end of the day, the internal divisions in the Taliban aren't really about moderates versus hardliners, or should or shouldn't we support these groups that we've always been linked to. But whether or not to integrate interdependently with the West in an economic fashion, in a political fashion. So I don't really think it's going to tarnish the relations. I think they're going to, as they have been, sort of downplaying it. They probably won't even acknowledge that it was Zawahiri as they haven't. But I don't think it takes away from the real concern that the world should have, that the Taliban is not going to abandon these extremist groups. They may be cautious and careful in the degree of outward support they provide these groups. But after all, even though it's played the role of broker of peace and negotiations between, for example, the Tehrik Taliban in Pakistan, the TTP had a spring offensive. They've had over 80 attacks, is what I've read in the press, against Pakistan. They don't seem to really be making quite an intent to restrain them. The Taliban has spoken well to the Chinese about the Uyghurs and the East Turkmenistan Islamic movement and some of the others, and relocated a number of those fighters, but they haven't arrested any, haven't detained any, haven't turned any over, and I don't think they're going to. So I think the strength of the sanctuary and support they provide these groups to operate freely is really all they need to do to enable these groups, and to still in their mind say, well, we're not, helping them to attack your countries, and we're not going to allow it. But the Taliban itself doesn't have total control over its territory. You could witness that simply through its difficulties with the ISIS-K, as well as the small resistance group that's still operating in the Panjshir Valley.
Building on your last response there, where does that leave the U.S. government? How do you think it should deal with the threat posed by al-Qaeda and the kind of broader question of the Taliban moving forward?
It's a tough balance. I believe, and probably most of it because I was a spy for a lot of years, communications is always good. When you're talking to people, there are opportunities that arise. It's not necessarily one where we're compromising or having negotiation, but at least you have some insight and you get through those contacts some sense of the dynamics within the Taliban itself. There are tells that come out of some of those communications. So I don't think we should recognize the Taliban at this point. I don't think we should provide that government, if it is a government, any aid. But we also have to balance that with human rights and considerations of the human suffering in Afghanistan, and how much do we want the people to suffer. So it's a tough balance. And I think there's a necessity for maintaining communications, for maintaining engagement in Afghanistan, and to certainly try to reach out if we can on the humanitarian issues and the hunger and such that the people are suffering, but not in a way that strengthens the Taliban hand or further legitimizes them as the government there.
Before we wrap up, any final thoughts?
No, I think we're going to be seeing a very interesting time in the world here in terms of the counterterrorist threat. The United States government wants to make a case that the over-the-horizon strategy worked, but I don't think this was a fair test. Over-the-horizon on the technical side works extremely well. I mean, I don't have any concerns about the reach of our platforms, be they unmanned aerial vehicles or satellites, but those things all need start points. Those things need people on the ground, collection on the ground in these countries. And I think Zawahiri gave us a great advantage in moving to Kabul, moving to a populated area, even though we don't have an official presence there on the ground. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy to actually penetrate these organizations operating under Afghan sanctuary to understand what their plans, intentions, and capabilities are. So certainly it's all we have, and we'll do it to the best of our abilities, but it's going to have limitations. So I don't think we should read too much into the potency of over the horizon from this leadership removal. Leaders are generally a little bit easier to find, as opposed to really disrupting operations at al-Qaeda or ISIS-K or other groups around the world where we don't have a presence and a cooperative local partner to further our efforts to suppress the threat. It's going to be hard.
That's all we have time for today, but thank you very much for joining the program, Doug.
Thanks for having me, Alistair. Appreciated it.
That's all the time we have for this week. I want to thank all three of our guests on today's program, Mick Mulroy, Javid Ahmad, and Douglas London, as well as our listeners for tuning in and our production team for their work on this week's episode. For the latest on MEI's coverage of counterterrorism in Afghanistan, please visit our website at www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.